The morning light filtered through thin curtains at Willowbrook Senior Living, casting long shadows across Harold's small room. At 80 years old, he had grown accustomed to the predictable rhythm of institutional life. The distant hum of wheelchairs in hallways, the gentle clatter of breakfast trays, the measured footsteps of nurses making their rounds. His weathered hands traced the edges of a faded photograph on his nightstand, showing a woman whose smile had once been his entire world. Harold's days had blended into a seamless tapestry of routine and resignation. The communal dining room echoed with polite conversations about medications and grandchildren who rarely visited. He found solace in the corner table by the window, where he could watch sparrows build their nests in the old oak tree outside. The same tree, the same view, the same quiet acceptance that love was something he had experienced once, completely, and would never know again. The scent of coffee and oatmeal drifted through the air as residents shuffled toward breakfast, their conversations a gentle murmur of shared loneliness disguised as companionship. Harold had learned to find peace in solitude, reading worn paperback novels and listening to classical music on his small radio. His heart had built walls around memories of dancing in the kitchen, of whispered promises, of a love that death had claimed 23 years ago. The walls of Willowbrook were adorned with black and white photographs of the town's history, faces of people who had loved and lost, dreamed and surrendered. Harold often studied these images during his slow walks down the corridors, wondering if those captured souls had ever imagined their stories would end in places like this. He had made his peace with being a footnote in someone else's story, a man whose chapter on love had already been written. That Tuesday morning began like any other, with Harold settling into his familiar routine of observation and quiet reflection. He watched new residents arrive occasionally, most accompanied by anxious adult children who promised to visit more often than they would. But something about this particular morning felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't quite identify. The air itself seemed to hold secrets, and Harold found himself unusually alert to the possibility that even at 80, life might still hold surprises. Margaret stepped through the entrance of Willowbrook with a dignity that commanded attention without demanding it. Her silver hair caught the morning light like spun moonbeams, and though she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world with a walking cane, there was something unmistakably vibrant about her presence. Harold noticed her immediately from his position at the breakfast table, and for the first time in months, he found himself genuinely curious about another person. She wore a lavender cardigan that brought out the blue in her eyes, and Harold observed how she thanked each staff member by name, as if she had already memorized their faces from some previous encounter. Margaret's daughter hovered nervously beside her, clutching papers and repeating instructions about medications and dietary restrictions, but Margaret herself seemed remarkably composed, surveying her new environment with the calm assessment of someone who had faced bigger challenges and intact. The dining room fell into a respectful quiet as Margaret was introduced. Harold found himself straightening his shoulders, smoothing his thin hair, and wondering why he suddenly cared about his appearance. There was something about her smile, not the polite, practiced smile of someone trying to make the best of a difficult situation, but a genuine expression of warmth that suggested she might actually find joy in unexpected places. When Margaret was seated 2 tables away, Harold caught himself stealing glances in her direction. She listened intently to Mrs. Peterson's endless stories about her cat, responded thoughtfully to Mr. Chen's complaints about the coffee, and somehow managed to make each person feel heard and valued. It had been so long since Harold had witnessed genuine human connection that he had almost forgotten how beautiful it could be to watch someone truly see other people. As breakfast concluded, Harold remained seated longer than usual, watching Margaret navigate her first morning at Willowbrook. There was something mysterious about her composure, a suggestion that she carried stories worth hearing. He found himself wondering what circumstances had brought her here, what losses she had endured, and whether someone with such evident capacity for warmth might still believe in the possibility of new beginnings, even in a place designed for endings. The next afternoon, Harold discovered Margaret sitting alone in the small garden behind Willowbrook, her fingers tracing the petals of late-blooming roses with gentle reverence. She looked up as he approached with his usual afternoon tea, and her smile was so genuinely welcoming that Harold felt something long dormant stir in his chest. "They're remarkable, aren't they?" she said, gesturing toward the flowers. "Still blooming so beautifully, even though everyone thinks their season has passed." Harold found himself nodding, though he wasn't entirely sure whether she was talking about the roses or something else entirely. He settled onto the bench beside her, maintaining a respectful distance while savoring the unexpected pleasure of companionship. "I've been walking past these roses for 3 years," he admitted, "but I never really looked at them until now." Margaret's laugh was like music he had forgotten existed, warm and unguarded and full of life. Their conversation flowed with surprising ease, touching on books they had loved, places they had traveled, and children they worried about. Margaret spoke of her late husband, Richard, with fondness rather than crushing grief, describing their 47 years of marriage as a beautiful dance that lasted just long enough for me to learn all the steps. Harold found himself sharing memories of his Elizabeth that he hadn't spoken aloud in years, surprised by how therapeutic it felt to remember her with someone who understood the particular weight of loving completely. As the afternoon sun slanted through the garden, Harold realized he was laughing for the first time in months. Margaret had a gift for finding humor in the smallest observations. The way Mr. Peterson always counted his pills 3 times, the dramatic sighs Mrs. Williams made when the cafeteria served meatloaf, the ongoing mystery of who kept rearranging the magazines in the common room. Her ability to find lightness without dismissing the genuine struggles around them felt like a form of grace. When a gentle breeze stirred the roses, Margaret closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, as if she were storing the moment for future reflection. "You know, Harold," she said quietly, "I've discovered that the heart doesn't actually have seasons. It just keeps blooming whenever it finds the right light." Harold felt something shift inside him, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, the right light might have finally found him too. Over the following weeks, Harold and Margaret developed their own quiet rhythm of connection. They saved seats for each other at meals, their conversations becoming islands of genuine intimacy in the sea of institutional routine. Harold found himself looking forward to Margaret's observations about their fellow residents, her gentle insights revealing layers of humanity he had previously overlooked. She had a remarkable ability to see past the surface complaints and medical concerns to the real people underneath. Margaret shared stories of her career as a librarian, describing how she had helped countless people find exactly the book they needed, even when they couldn't articulate what they were searching for. "Books were just the beginning," she explained during one of their garden conversations. "What people really wanted was to feel understood, to know that someone else had walked through their particular darkness and found a way to write about it." Harold realized that Margaret was doing something similar for him, helping him rediscover parts of himself he had thought were lost forever. Their friendship deepened through shared silences as much as conversations. They would sit together in the common room during afternoon reading time, occasionally exchanging meaningful glances over their books, communicating in a language that transcended words. Harold began to notice details he had ignored for years, the way afternoon light transformed the institutional walls into something almost beautiful, how the sound of Margaret's laughter made other residents smile even when they weren't part of the conversation. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the garden, Margaret spoke about the difference between loneliness and solitude. "I was lonely for months after Richard died," she said softly, "even when I was surrounded by people. But solitude is different. It's chosen, peaceful. I thought I had made my peace with solitude." She paused, watching a pair of cardinals settle in the oak tree. "But I'm beginning to remember the difference between being alone and being lonely." Harold felt his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with his blood pressure medication. He was beginning to understand that what he had mistaken for contentment in his routine had actually been a form of surrender. Margaret's presence was awakening feelings he had assumed were permanently archived with his youth, and the realization was both thrilling and terrifying. At 80, was it possible that his heart still had capacity for transformation? During one of their evening conversations, Margaret revealed that she had specifically chosen Willowbrook after researching every senior living facility within 50 miles. "My daughter thought I was being too particular," she laughed, "but I told her that if I was going to spend my remaining years somewhere, I wanted it to be a place where I might still find reasons to be surprised." Harold was struck by the intentionality of her choice, the way she had approached even this transition as an opportunity rather than a defeat. Margaret's stories gradually revealed a woman who had faced significant challenges with remarkable resilience. She had nursed Richard through 5 years of Alzheimer's disease, watching the man she loved disappear gradually while caring for him with unwavering devotion. She had buried both of her parents, survived breast cancer, and raised 2 children largely on her own while Richard traveled for work. Yet somehow, these experiences had deepened rather than diminished her capacity for joy. Harold found himself sharing memories he had guarded for decades. He spoke of Elizabeth's battle with emphysema, the helplessness he had felt watching her struggle for breath, the guilt that had haunted him for feeling relieved when her suffering finally ended. Margaret listened without judgment, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand when the memories became particularly difficult. Her touch was electric, sending warmth through his entire body and reminding him that he was still capable of physical response. One afternoon, Margaret brought out a small photo album, sharing images from her life with the same generosity she offered her stories. Harold saw her as a young bride, radiant in white lace, as a new mother, exhausted but glowing, as a middle-aged woman receiving some kind of professional award, as a grandmother surrounded by children who clearly adored her. "Every stage had its beauty," she said, turning the pages slowly. "I'm curious to see what beauty this stage might hold." As Margaret spoke about embracing each phase of life with openness, Harold realized he had been living as if his story was essentially over, just waiting for the final pages to be written. But watching Margaret's animated face as she described her hopes for their remaining years, he began to wonder if perhaps the most interesting chapters might still be ahead. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and suddenly remembering that he had once known how to fly. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Harold found Margaret crying softly in the small library off the main corridor. She was holding a letter, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long suppressed. Without hesitation, Harold sat beside her, offering his handkerchief and his presence without demanding explanations. In that moment, he realized that caring for Margaret had become as natural as breathing, and the intensity of his concern surprised him. The letter was from Margaret's son in California, announcing his upcoming divorce and asking if she could help financially with legal fees. "It's not about the money," Margaret explained through her tears. "It's about watching your children struggle and being too old and too far away to help in any meaningful way. I raised him to be independent, but I never expected independence to feel so much like abandonment." Harold understood completely. His own children lived busy lives in distant cities, checking in dutifully but rarely connecting meaningfully. Yeah. Harold found himself sharing his own fears about becoming irrelevant to the people he loved most. He spoke about his daughter's polite phone calls, full of updates about grandchildren he rarely saw and accomplishments that felt disconnected from his daily reality. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm already gone," he admitted. "If I'm just a ghost pretending to still be alive, going through the motions of living without any real impact on anyone else's world." Margaret looked at him with such tenderness that Harold felt exposed and cherished simultaneously. "Harold," she said quietly, "you have completely changed my experience of this place. Before we became friends, I was just surviving each day. Now I wake up excited about our conversations, curious about your thoughts on everything from the weather to the meaning of existence. How can you possibly think you don't matter?" Her words hit him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. In that moment of mutual vulnerability, Harold realized that what was growing between them transcended simple friendship or companionship. They were falling in love, not with the passionate intensity of youth, but with the deep recognition of kindred spirits who had found each other against impossible odds. The thought terrified him, because loving someone at his age meant accepting the probability of loss. But it also filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The following week, Willowbrook organized its monthly social evening, complete with a small band playing songs from the 1940s and 50s. Harold typically avoided these events, finding them artificial and melancholy. But Margaret convinced him to attend by promising they could leave early if he felt uncomfortable. As they entered the decorated common room, Harold was surprised to find himself actually enjoying the festive atmosphere, seeing it through Margaret's eyes as an opportunity for joy rather than a reminder of diminished capabilities. When the band began playing "The Way You Look Tonight," Margaret turned to Harold with a mischievous smile. "I should mention that Richard was a terrible dancer," she said, "but I loved dancing with him anyway because he was brave enough to try." Before Harold could protest that his own dancing days were long behind him, Margaret was leading him onto the small dance floor, her hand warm and confident in his. They moved together slowly, carefully, Harold's hand resting lightly on Margaret's waist while she hummed along with the familiar melody. He was amazed by how natural it felt to hold her, how perfectly they fit together despite their individual frailties and limitations. Other residents watched with approving smiles, and Harold realized that their growing connection had become a source of hope for everyone who witnessed it, proof that love could bloom even in winter. As they swayed to the music, Margaret whispered, "I never thought I would dance again after Richard died. I assumed that part of my life was over forever." Harold felt his throat tighten with emotion, understanding exactly what she meant. They were discovering together that endings weren't always permanent, that the heart could surprise them with its capacity for renewal even when the body showed clear signs of decline. When the song ended, they remained in each other's arms for a moment longer than necessary, neither wanting to break the spell of perfect connection they had created. Harold realized that he was no longer simply surviving his remaining years. He was actively living them, feeling truly alive for the first time since Elizabeth's death. The transformation was miraculous and terrifying, like discovering he had wings just as he was learning to accept that he would never fly again. Harold began waking earlier each morning, not because his sleep patterns demanded it, but because he was eager to see Margaret at breakfast. Their relationship had evolved into something that transcended simple friendship, though neither had yet spoken the word love aloud. They communicated in glances across the dining room, in books left on each other's nightstands, in small gestures of care that spoke louder than any declaration might have. Margaret started keeping a small journal, sharing excerpts with Harold during their afternoon conversations. Her entries captured moments of beauty they had discovered together, the way morning light transformed the institutional hallways, the kindness of night shift nurses who thought no one was watching, the unexpected dignity of their fellow residents facing their own challenges with grace. Through Margaret's eyes, Harold began seeing Willowbrook as a community rather than just a holding place for the discarded elderly. One evening, Margaret appeared at Harold's door with a chess set, claiming she had found it in the activity room but suspected he might be a worthy opponent. As they set up the pieces on Harold's small table, their fingers occasionally brushed, sending electricity through both of them. The game became secondary to their conversation, but Harold was touched by Margaret's thoughtfulness in finding ways to spend more intimate time together away from the common areas. Their chess games became a weekly ritual, though they rarely finished a complete game before getting distracted by deeper conversations. Margaret would ask Harold about his dreams, not just his sleep dreams, but the ambitions he had carried throughout his life, the roads not taken, the chances he wished he had been brave enough to pursue. In return, Harold encouraged Margaret to talk about her regrets, her fears, and her hopes for whatever time remained ahead of them. During one particularly intense conversation, Margaret reached across the chessboard and took Harold's hand. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I haven't felt this way about anyone since Richard died, and I'm terrified because I know how this story has to end eventually. But I'm also more grateful than I know how to express because you've reminded me that my heart is still capable of expanding even now." Harold squeezed her hand, understanding that they were both acknowledging the love that had grown between them without needing to analyze or define it. Harold spent sleepless nights wrestling with the implications of loving Margaret. At 80, every relationship carried the weight of impermanence, but the love he felt for her was so profound that it seemed worth any eventual pain. He found himself calculating odds the way he never had in his youth. How many good years might they realistically have together? What complications his heart condition or her arthritis might create? Whether it was fair to burden each other with the intensity of feelings that couldn't possibly have enough time to fully develop. Margaret seemed to be having similar struggles. Harold noticed her staring out windows with a contemplative expression that suggested internal battles between hope and practical caution. One afternoon, she asked him directly what she thought about people their age falling in love. "Are we being foolish, Harold? Are we setting ourselves up for heartbreak that we're too old to recover from?" Her vulnerability in asking the question made Harold love her even more. Harold spent an entire afternoon crafting his response, wanting to give Margaret the honesty she deserved. "Margaret," he said during their evening walk, "I've been asking myself the same questions. But I keep coming back to this. We're both going to experience loss and grief regardless of whether we love each other or not. The question isn't whether loving you will cause me pain. It's whether the joy of loving you is worth the inevitable pain of losing you." Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes filling with tears that somehow looked more like relief than sadness. "And what conclusion have you reached?" she asked softly. Harold took her hands in his, feeling the smoothness of her wedding ring, which she still wore on her right hand after moving her wedding band following Richard's death. "I've concluded that a broken heart from loving you completely would be infinitely preferable to a safe heart that never got to experience this miracle." That night, Harold couldn't sleep, but for once, his insomnia felt like anticipation rather than anxiety. He had effectively declared his love for Margaret without using the specific words, and her tears had suggested that his feelings were reciprocated. At 80 years old, he was embarking on a love affair that might be brief, but would undoubtedly be profound. The thought filled him with an energy he hadn't experienced since his 20s, a reminder that the capacity for passion doesn't necessarily diminish with age. The next morning, Margaret knocked on Harold's door earlier than usual, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a nervous smile. "I couldn't sleep either," she said, settling into his reading chair as if she belonged there. They spent the pre-dawn hours talking about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing with the ease of people who had found their perfect conversational partner. Harold realized that this kind of intellectual and emotional intimacy was what he had missed most during his years of loneliness. Margaret confessed that she had been researching the possibility of couples sharing rooms at Willowbrook, though she blushed as she mentioned it. "I'm not suggesting anything improper," she said quickly, "but I was curious about whether 2 people our age could could make their connection formal." Harold was touched by her old-fashioned discretion, even as he was thrilled by the implication that she was thinking about a future that included both of them. Their relationship had begun attracting attention from other residents, most of it warmly approving. Mrs. Peterson had started calling them the Lovebirds, and Mr. Chen had jokingly asked Harold for dating advice. The staff members seemed genuinely delighted by their connection, with several nurses commenting on how much happier both Harold and Margaret appeared since they had found each other. Their love was becoming a source of hope for the entire Willowbrook community. Harold found himself thinking about the concept of emotional maturity in ways he never had during his youth. Loving Margaret felt completely different from the passion he had experienced with Elizabeth decades earlier. Not less intense, but more intentional, more grateful, more aware of its own preciousness. They approached their relationship with the wisdom of people who understood that love was both a gift and a responsibility, something to be cherished rather than taken for granted. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from the garden, Margaret turned to Harold with an expression of complete openness. "Harold," she said quietly, "I love you. Not the way I loved Richard, because that was a different lifetime, but completely and specifically and with full knowledge of who we both are now." Harold felt his heart expand beyond what he had thought possible, grateful for Margaret's courage in speaking the words that had been living in both their hearts. Harold's response came not in words, but in actions. He reached for Margaret's face, tracing the lines around her eyes with gentle fingers, memorizing every detail of the woman who had transformed her final chapter into something beautiful. "Margaret," he whispered, "I love you with every year I've lived, every loss I've survived, every moment of loneliness that led me to this bench, to this garden, to you." Their first kiss was soft, tentative, and filled with decades of accumulated wisdom about what love actually means. In the days that followed, Harold and Margaret moved through Willowbrook with the quiet radiance of people who had found something precious in an unexpected place. They held hands during meals, shared books with meaningful passages marked, and created small rituals of affection that made their love visible to everyone around them. Their relationship became a testament to the possibility that significant love stories could begin at any age. Margaret introduced Harold to poetry he had never appreciated, reading Mary Oliver and Billy Collins aloud during their afternoon garden sessions. Harold shared his passion for history, explaining how the town of Willowbrook had evolved over the decades, pointing out architectural details that revealed the building's past as a private mansion. They were teaching each other to see the world through different eyes, expanding their perspectives even as their physical worlds had contracted to the boundaries of the facility. Their love letters to each other became legendary among the staff, who would find folded notes tucked under breakfast plates or hidden in library books. Margaret wrote about how Harold's laugh lines told the story of a life well lived. Harold wrote about how Margaret's gentle strength reminded him that courage could be quiet and still change everything. They were creating a written record of mature love that might inspire other residents to remain open to connection. One afternoon, Margaret surprised Harold by announcing that she had spoken with the administration about the possibility of adjacent rooms. "I want to wake up knowing you're nearby," she explained, "and I want to be able to take care of you. If you get sick, just as I hope you would take care of me." Harold realized that Margaret was proposing something deeper than romance. She was suggesting they create a genuine partnership for whatever time remained to them. The administration's approval of their room arrangement felt like a victory that neither Harold nor Margaret had dared to expect. Moving Margaret's belongings into the room adjacent to Harold's became a celebration involving half the residents of Willowbrook, with everyone contributing small touches to make the space reflect their new partnership. Harold was amazed by how much joy their love affair had brought to the entire community, as if everyone living there needed proof that meaningful connections could still develop. Their new living arrangement allowed for an intimacy that transcended physical attraction, though Harold was surprised by how much he still desired Margaret's touch, her presence, her attention. They would sit together in the evenings reading separate books, occasionally reaching over to share a passage or simply to confirm that the other person was still there. The comfort of reliable companionship felt like luxury after years of solitude. Margaret began planning small adventures within the constraints of their environment. She organized sunset picnics on their shared balcony, complete with sandwiches smuggled from the cafeteria and flowers picked from the garden. She convinced Harold to participate in the facility's talent show, where they performed a dramatic reading from Romeo and Juliet that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Margaret had a gift for finding magic in mundane circumstances. Harold started writing poetry for the first time in his life, inspired by Margaret's appreciation for language and beauty. His verses were simple but heartfelt, capturing moments of their daily life together with the attention of someone who understands that ordinary moments could be sacred. Margaret kept every poem in a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother, treating Harold's words like treasures worth preserving. Their relationship had evolved beyond romance into true partnership. They made decisions together about everything from meal choices to medical appointments, supporting each other through difficult days and celebrating small victories with shared joy. Harold realized that this was what marriage actually meant, not the legal ceremony or social recognition, but the daily choice to prioritize another person's well-being alongside your own happiness. On a particularly beautiful spring morning, Harold woke to find Margaret already dressed and waiting with a mysterious smile. She had arranged for a wheelchair-accessible van to take them to the town's botanical garden, where she had planned a private celebration of what she called our 6-month anniversary of admitting we love each other. Harold was touched by her attention to anniversaries, her insistence on marking the passage of time in positive rather than diminishing terms. As they walked slowly through the botanical garden, Margaret pointed out flowers that reminded her of different stages of their relationship. The tentative daffodils were like their first conversations, she explained. The bold tulips resembled Harold's courage in dancing with her. The climbing roses represented how their love had grown beyond what either had thought possible. Harold realized that Margaret had a poet's soul, finding metaphors and meaning in everything around them. They found a bench overlooking a small pond where ducks paddled peacefully among lily pads. Margaret pulled out a small wrapped package, explaining that she had asked her daughter to send something special from her storage unit. Inside was a vintage compass that had belonged to her father, a gift she wanted Harold to have because you helped me find my way to joy again, even when I thought I was permanently lost. Harold felt overwhelmed by the symbolism of Margaret's gift and by the realization that they were creating traditions and memories that would outlast their physical presence. "Margaret," he said, holding the compass carefully in his weathered hands, "you've taught me that the heart doesn't actually age the way the body does. You've reminded me that love isn't reserved for the young. It's available to anyone brave enough to stay open to possibilities." As they sat holding hands by the pond, watching the ducks navigate their small world with purposeful grace, Harold understood that this was what happiness actually looked like in their 80s. Not the explosive passion of youth, but the deep satisfaction of being completely known and cherished by another person. They had found second-chance love that was simultaneously their most mature and most innocent relationship, built on acceptance rather than expectation. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe to Voices After 50 for more true, emotional tales about love, time, and second chances. And before you go, watch the next story on our channel, another unforgettable journey about the loves we never truly lose.